For example, Daphne became an excellent tennis player, but it was not she playing. In her mind, it was Mary. When Daphne would rush the net or serve with great force, it wasn't really Daphne. It was always Mary. Daphne had been isolated and lived in a world within. She was married, but her husband knew nothing of her mind's inner workings. Just as Daphne wanted a friend and had Mary, Mary wanted to she wanted to tell me about her life and the life of Mary and Daphne together. To questions posed to Daphne such as, "What's it like for Mary?" or "What were you doing when Daphne did such and such?" Mary gradually and proudly responded. Mary told me during a number of sessions what she had done in her life. When Daphne would write those bizarre comments in the margin of office memos, it was because Daphne and Mary were playing and having so much fun. When Daphne would leave her own infant child unattended, sometimes for hours, while she went into a closet, it was to relive her own experience with her mother and to be regaled by Mary in whatever playful, internally boisterous invention was being created. When Daphne jumped from the Golden Gate Bridge, it was as a lark, impelled by Mary. She only landed on the catwalk because Daphne didn't want to die and made sure that she hit something solid. In effect, Daphne was both in and out of a delusional state, enough to keep her alive, but not thoroughly enough to protect herself from her erstwhile friend's playful and very deadly games. This series of tales and events of Mary was developed in a number of threads over the first year of therapy. It was not one clear-cut exposition of the history of a delusional state. Time was spent talking about Daphne's day-to-day life. Her depression, suicidal urges also had to be dealt with. Occasional family meetings were held to stabilize her and afford her whatever protection was necessary. Gradually, interspersed among details of Daphne's life and the joint history of Mary, for both of them were willing to give me more information, material emerged about other delusional figures in Daphne's internal life. This new information emerged slowly and fitfully as I asked questions about whether or not anything else might exist on a similar level as Mary. Illusory as these beings appear to us, Daphne believed that they existed as much as Mary, herself, and me. There was a threatening man representing her father, and the fiery woman whose head was ringed with flames representing her mother. They had both been with her from the age of 4 or 5. She doesn't know if Mary came before them. They had all been there for so long. When she couldn't escape her fear, she left the girl to deal with the man and the fiery woman, while she and Mary went off to some imaginary refuge to play. Being the psychiatrist in such a situation is a very intense experience. With Daphne, I knew that we were in for a roller coaster of craziness and suicidality. I knew I'd be worried about her, that there'd be a moment when my concern for her well-being would become so strong that I would intervene and hospitalize her. Perhaps she'd go voluntarily, perhaps her family would help, perhaps I'd have to call the police. Suicide attempts and hospitalizations were caused by this dissociative mind play. In the mind of Daphne, during more than 50 years, things became very complicated. At times, the girl would make a suicide attempt because she, the girl, felt so terrible, or to escape one of her internal parental tormentors. Even though it was Daphne who made the suicide attempt, in her mind it was the miserable girl who tried to kill herself, while Daphne, playing with Mary, rattled around in some externalized space, unable and unwilling to help the girl who was really Daphne. Sometimes Daphne and Mary would follow Mary's suggestion and goad the girl into some self-destructive behavior, leading to hospitalization. At other times, Daphne, with Mary, would act so bizarrely and antagonistically that she would be hospitalized for overt psychosis or threatening behavior. T.S. Eliot's line, "In my beginning is my end," applies to the analysis and exploration of delusional beings. In the telling, in the historical exploration of how the delusion forms, a slight interjection of rationality begins. but it's a struggle for life and soul, and Mary was not going to go easily. For a period of a little less than a year, Daphne remained very suicidal. To give up a best friend is difficult, never mind one to whom one is fused in an even more compelling internal delusional reality. To give up a best friend who appeared to have saved one from the terrors inflicted on the girl would be even more difficult. To be left as the vulnerable girl, which is what Daphne feared she would become without Mary, was even more frightening. I stayed as attuned as possible to the likelihood of suicide, taking all threats quite seriously and hospitalizing Daphne for 4 reasonably short hospitalizations as she gave up her delusional world of Mary. Usually the hospitalization itself was enough, but once she secreted a lethal dose of pills in her vagina and took a serious overdose in the hospital at Mary's direction. She survived because I'd put her on suicide watch and only had the pills in her system for a short time. This suicide attempt was Mary's last gasp. Daphne realized how serious this mind game was and began to use her own intellect to protect herself against going off with Mary. She saw how she loved being with Mary, how any sadness or anxiety would lead to her going off to her delusional reality, leaving the undefended girl to handle situations that were difficult. Little by little, over the next few months, some of it in the hospital, she relinquished a delusional system that had lasted for more than 55 years. She returned to work, had 10 good years with her husband before his death, and reconciled with her children. Some family sessions aided in the transition to a good family life. All her family really needed to know was that it really wasn't intentional on her part, and that she had been terribly confused for all those years. She continues to lead an active life with many friends. Mary is hardly ever necessary. Daphne is now aware of whatever she does to bring up Mary. If stressed or overwhelmed by real-life experiences, she is aware that she might go off to Mary. She's forewarned, hence armed with her own rational perspective to understand Mary and the destructive aspects of delusional life. For the last 15 years, she has been essentially delusion-free. Daphne is just one of a number of examples of seemingly lost and untreatable people who were able to overcome their delusional beliefs through a transforming, exploratory, dynamic understanding of the origins and ramifications of their delusional beliefs. In this era of managed care, overly heavy reliance on medication, and consignment of the very disturbed to a warehousing and revolving door approach from hospital to halfway house to homelessness, it is important to know that there is hope for even those most lost. Unfortunately, though, most psychiatrists and mental health professionals have not entered into the world of madness to try to help their patients make conscious the personal and metaphorical meaning of withdrawal, hallucinations, and delusions. Too often, psychiatrists have eschewed a psychodynamic understanding of their patients' disorders, relying upon medications and superficial reality-based approaches in an attempt to shore up these fragile patients. All too often, the field of psychiatry, with little experience in in-depth work with schizophrenic and delusional disorders, regards such patients as untreatable, consigning them to excessive medications and inadequate attempts to aid the person in understanding and comprehending the extent of his or her disturbance.